Back in this project, we of course have an error modal. This is a nice little modal where I actually already see an opportunity to use a fragment. So let's quickly do that. But that's of course not the focus here. Instead here, we can now use a portal, because this entire modal actually shouldn't be rendered in the place where it is being rendered. Again, let me show you what I mean. If we inspect the real DOM that is being rendered, and I trigger that modal by submitting an invalid form, you see the modal divs for the backdrop and for the card, for the modal overlay, are being rendered here next to that card that holds my form, inside of the root div. Now in this application, because it's so tiny, that's actually not too bad. But of course, it's easy to imagine that you have an application where your add user component is not that close to the top of the whole application, but where it's deeply nested in some other components. And therefore, your backdrop and your modal divs would also be deeply nested in some other content in your DOM. And I actually would want to have them, let's say, here. I can drag and drop them here in the dev tools. I might want to have that structure, the backdrop div right below the body, so as a direct child of the body. And the same for the modal, a direct child of the body next to that root div, which holds the rest of our application. And this is something you can achieve with, well, portals. So now that I told you that portals are that great, how do we actually use them? Portals need two things. You need a place you want to port the component to, and then you need to let the component know that it should have a portal to that place. Now, to mark that place, we go into the public folder and there into the HTML file which is being rendered in the end. And here it's common that you add a div with an ID which you will then use to identify this place later. And here I could have my backdrop root and then also maybe my modal root. And you could create multiple such roots for different kinds of components that should be portaled there. Or you simplify this a bit and you have your backdrop root and simply your overlay root, which will then hold all kinds of overlays, modals, side drawers, and so on. And that's what I'll go with. So I added these two divs here, and then I save that file and go back to my components. Now let's work on the error modal, and let's tell React that this actually should be portaled somewhere. For that, to make this very easy, I will actually add a constant here, which I'll name backdrop, and this will be a new component, and I'll add it in this same file because in this app, I only use this backdrop component in conjunction with my modal. So I'll store all those components in one big file, but you could also split it into multiple component files, especially if you would use the backdrop in conjunction with other components as well. Here I'll only use it there though, so then I have my props, and now here I will return that div which gets my backdrop class. Now I'll also add my modal overlay component here, which gets props. And there I will return this card. And I'll actually cut this like this. So I basically split my modal into two separate components now, backdrop and modal overlay, because that will make working with portals much easier. We can also remove the backdrop div down there in the error modal now. So what do we now do here? In the end here, in that fragment, we can add an expression because we're still inside of JSX code here. And we now want to call a method which is actually not defined on React, but on another library that comes together with React, the React DOM library. You can imagine React being the library that has all the React features, state management, and so on baked in. And React DOM uses React to bring that logic and these features into the web browser. So to make them compatible to working with the DOM. Put in other words, the React library itself doesn't care whether you run it in an environment that has a DOM or if you would use it to build a native app. And for example, you can use React Native in conjunction with React to build native mobile apps. I do have a separate course on that though, so let's not worry about that here. So React DOM is kind of the adapter for React to the browser. And therefore, since now we're going to portal something into a different place in the real DOM, we need to import from React DOM. So import something from React-DOM. And that something here can just be React DOM. So you can give this any name you want, but since I named my React import React, I'll name this React DOM. And on React DOM, you can now call a createPortal method. Now the createPortal method takes two arguments. The first one is your React node that should be rendered. And here I can render my backdrop, let's say, like this. Important here, it wants JSX. So you don't pass just backdrop like this. Instead, you really render it like this. This is also very convenient because this allows me, of course, to forward my onClick prop here and get access to props on confirm, which I need to pass here to ensure that everything still works. So I can now set onClick here in my error modal and forward the function I get on the onConfirm prop to the onClick prop inside of that new backdrop component. Now, the second argument of createPortal is a pointer to that container in the real DOM where this element should be rendered in. And in my case, I of course want to render my backdrop here in that backdrop root component. So, back in error modal, here we need to select this, and we don't just pass backdrop root or anything like that. Instead, we really select the element where it should be rendered to. And for this, we use a DOM API. We use document get element by ID, for example, and get access to the backdrop root. So we really get access to a real HTML DOM element, a DOM node here. And we do this with an API that is provided by the browser. Document get element by ID has nothing to do with React. We really get access to a real DOM element with this API. Normally, we don't use that in React because we let React do everything, but here we explicitly need to use this. By the way, just as we needed an element selected like this in index.js. There, we also rendered the root component with the render method into a place selected with get element by ID. We're using the same logic now, but now we're not rendering an element there, but instead inside of an existing application, which is already being rendered by React, we move the HTML content that is about to be rendered into a different place. With that, let me reformat this and save it. And if we now go back and I click on Add User, you see the backdrop appears. The modal does not, because I haven't added the logic for this yet, but the backdrop does. And in the Elements tab, we see that in the backdrop root, we now got the modal backdrop. And now it will always be there, no matter where you would use your error modal in your JSX code, no matter how deeply nested it is in other elements. It will always be here, which is of course very close to the body. We need this marker here though, but we could have also selected the body itself if we really wanted it as a direct child of body. But I think this is a bit easier to understand, which is why I use these extra hook divs, if you want to call them like this. Now let's repeat this for the actual overlay. For that, I'll add a new expression here, React DOM createPortal. And here I want to render my modal overlay component. And my modal overlay component needs a bunch of props, which I now, of course, want to forward. It needs a title, it needs a content, and it needs onConfirm. So I'll just forward this. I'll forward the title, which I get on props title, the message, which I get on props message. I'll get my onConfirm was the last one, I think. Props onConfirm. because actions, of course, is not a prop. So props on confirm is the last one. Now I'm forwarding all of this. And now, of course, we also, just as with the backdrop, need to let React DOM know where it should render this HTML content that needs to be rendered. For that, I'll use document get element by ID and select my overlay root, which was that other div I created in the index.html file. And with that saved, if I reload and click add user, we see the modal, and interaction with the backdrop doesn't work, as I can tell. I will need to fix this, but with the modal it works, and we see everything is rendered in the divs where it should be rendered and no longer nested in our other HTML code. So let's quickly fix that backdrop. Yeah, I should of course forward this on confirm here, because I use on confirm here inside of that backdrop. So I should set an on confirm prop, but with that, it now works and I can close it by clicking on the backdrop again. So that's the portal. And the idea really just is that the rendered HTML content is moved somewhere else. In your JSX code, you now use that error modal just as you did before. Nothing changed there. In add user, I still have my error modal here. But it's now rendered. Its HTML code is now rendered in a different place. We use that error modal just as we used it before. And that's the cool thing about the portal. Nothing changes there. We can communicate with it as we did before. We can use it as if it would be rendered here. It just isn't. Also worth the note, React DOM create portal can be used anywhere where you would otherwise use JSX code. Of course, wrapped in curly braces because we're calling JavaScript code here, but we could have just rendered the backdrop here otherwise, right? That would have been our alternative. So wherever you would normally just use the component, you can use create portal to move that component's HTML content somewhere else. Only in the actual DOM that is being rendered. In JSX, in your components, you continue working with those components as you did before.